So, how do the experts actually make sense of the wild world of politics? I mean, how do they really compare countries that are worlds apart and figure out who's pulling the strings? Well, today we're cracking open that very toolkit. We're going to dive into the big ideas political scientists use to understand political systems everywhere, from the United States all the way to China, and everything in between. No, really, think about that for a second. You've got the USA, China, Brazil. I mean, these places couldn't be more different, right? Their history, their culture, their whole way of doing government. Just slapping a label on them like democracy or not a democracy, that doesn't even begin to tell the real story. To actually compare them in a meaningful, scientific way, you need a system. You need a set of tools or maybe lenses to bring it all into focus. And that right there, that's the big question we're tackling today. All right, so where do we even start with all this? Let's begin with the simplest idea of them all. We're going to look at a country's political system like it's a machine. Yeah, a machine. It sounds basic, I know, but it's a surprisingly powerful way to start thinking about how any government really works, no matter how complicated it looks from the outside. This way of thinking is officially called the systems approach. It was a big deal, and a political scientist named David Easton was one of its main champions. And here's the core idea. It's pretty clever. You treat the entire political system like a black box. Seriously, for now, we're not even going to peek inside. All we care about is what goes in and what comes out. It's a way to cut through all the noise and simplify what is, let's be honest, a really messy reality. Okay, so here's a visual of how that black box is supposed to work. On one side, you've got the inputs pouring in. Think of inputs as two main things. First, you have demands from the people. Things like protests, calling for better health care, or citizens wanting new roads. But you also have support. That's stuff like people voting, paying their taxes, or just generally following the law. All of that stuff flows into the political system, which just takes it all in. And then what spits out the other end? Well, those are the outputs. These are the concrete actions and decisions the government makes. We're talking new laws, new policies, court decisions, you name it. But, and this is super important, it doesn't just stop there. There's a feedback loop. See, those outputs go back out into the world and change things, which in turn creates brand new demands and new forms of support. So the whole cycle just keeps on going. Input, process, output, and repeat. Okay, so that input-output machine is a great starting point, but you're probably thinking the same thing I am. What is actually going on inside that black box? How does the magic happen? How do protests and votes actually get turned into laws? Well, it's time to pop the hood and take a look at the engine. That brings us to our next big idea. And this is what's known as the structural functional approach, an idea really pushed forward by Gabriel Almond. The thinking goes like this. For any political system to just survive, it has to do certain essential jobs. These are its functions. And to do those jobs, it uses specific tools or institutions. Those are its structures. Think of things like political parties, courts, or parliaments. These are the gears of the machine. So now, the big question is, which parts of the machine do which jobs? Let's take something like interest articulation. That's just a fancy way of saying expressing what people want. In the US, that job might be done by massive lobbying groups. In another country, it might be village elders. Or look at rulemaking. In most places, that's the job of a legislature, right? But the way a parliament in the UK does it is totally different from how the US Congress does it. See? Suddenly, we have a common framework to compare totally different systems. We're not just comparing apples and oranges anymore. But here's the thing. These political machines aren't just sitting there, frozen in time. They're more like living organisms. They're constantly in motion. They grow, they change, they get better at what they do. Or sometimes they start to rust, break down, and fall apart. And that brings in the super important element of time. And this leads us to two very different stories about how political systems change. On the one hand, you've got the optimistic view, called political development. A thinker named Lucian Pye was a big proponent of this. The idea is that over time, systems just get better, more complex, more capable of handling problems. But then there's the flip side. Samuel Huntington came along with a pretty stark warning he called political decay. This is what happens when a society is changing way faster than its government can handle. When the institutions just can't keep up with the pace of change, things start to get unstable. And Huntington put it really bluntly. He said that political decay is when you see a decrease in competence and credibility and establishment of institutional corruption. In other words, when the government can't keep up, people stop trusting it. It stops being able to do its job effectively. And what fills that vacuum? Corruption, chaos. It's a pretty heavy reminder that progress isn't a one-way street, and political stability is something that can absolutely be lost.
Up to this point, we've basically been looking at each country in its own little bubble. But think about it. Does any country really operate on its own these days? Both of those ideas, development and decay, kind of assume that all the big changes are happening inside a country. But what if that's wrong? What if the biggest forces shaping a country's destiny are actually coming from the outside? To really get the whole story, we have to zoom way out.
And this brings us to a really game-changing and honestly pretty controversial idea: dependency theory. Folks like A.G. Frank looked at the world and said, hold on a second, this global economy is not a level playing field, it's rigged. This idea totally blows up our black box model. It says you can't understand a country's politics in isolation because the whole world is locked into this structure where rich, core countries get ahead by, and this is the key part, actively keeping poorer periphery countries behind.
And here's how that relationship works in practice. You have raw materials, we're talking coffee, oil, minerals, you name it, gushing out of the poorer periphery countries and flowing straight to the wealthy core. What do the core countries do? They take those raw materials, turn them into expensive stuff like iPhones or cars, and then sell them right back to the rest of the world, including the periphery, for a huge profit. The theory argues this isn't an accident. It's a system that's literally designed to keep the rich, rich, and the poor, poor.
And later, this idea got even more detailed with something called world systems theory from Immanuel Wallerstein. He said it's not just two groups, but three. You still got the core, the big economic bosses, and the periphery, the ones providing all the cheap labor and resources. But then there's this really interesting middle group, the semi-periphery. Think of countries like India or Brazil. They're kind of stuck in the middle. They get exploited by the core, for sure, but they also get to do some of the exploiting of the periphery. They're like the middle managers of the global economy, and they help keep the whole system from falling apart.
Wow, okay, so let's take a breath. We have gone on quite a journey, haven't we? We started by looking at politics like a simple machine. Then we opened it up to see the gears inside. We watched that machine change over time, and then, bam, we zoomed all the way out to see it's just one tiny part of a massive, tangled global economic web. Each new view, each new lens, gave us a completely different picture.
So let's just quickly run through those four main lenses one more time. First, we had the system view, the simple input-output machine. Then, the structural view, where we looked at the machine's inner parts and what they do. Third was the dynamic view, seeing that machine either getting better or breaking down. And finally, the global view, which put that machine in its place within the whole world system. And this, right here, is probably the most important thing to remember from all of this. There isn't one single correct lens. None of them tells you the whole story on its own. They're tools in a toolkit. Each one shows you something important, something the others might miss. The real genius is knowing which tool to pull out for which job, to really understand the complex reality of who has power and why. So I'm going to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Think about our world right now, a world of massive tech companies that are bigger than some countries, a world facing climate change, a world dealing with pandemics. When you look at those huge global challenges, which one of these lenses do you think helps us best understand who's really in charge today? Is power still located inside the political machine of individual countries, or is it all about the dynamics of that bigger global system? The lens you pick, well, that says everything about where you think the real power is.